Hi everyone, and here's a second video for this week, in addition to the one that you have that gives you a cartoon of the progress of science and what kind of some elements of what science seems to be from my perspective, my cartoon perspective. And again, as always, you take what you like and leave the rest from what I say. I'm giving you a perspective. I'm trying not to be opinionated, but I am giving you a perspective that comes from my background and my experience and my studying and studying and learning of all kinds, I guess. And we're going to talk about learning in a minute, actually, because that's relevant to the whole subject. So what I want to do with this video is, and I sort of hope this is becoming obvious at this point, but I don't know that it is, and it's sometimes a very hard thing to get or to appreciate, and we'll see if I can convey it. So what I want to do, I could title this video "Why It Isn't a Simple Matter of Compromise." So in other words, why can't religion compromise and science compromise and the two get along? Why is it not a simple matter of compromise? And I don't think that it is. and so I want to talk about this because what we have going on is not really just a clash of content, the content of religion and the content of science. It's a clash of fundamentally different ways of seeing the world, fundamentally different ways of perceiving reality, and actually fundamentally different ways of knowing. There's an entire field of philosophy called epistemology, it's this field of philosophy which investigates how we can possibly know anything and how we know what we think we know. And in what ways do we know what we think we know? So in this field of epistemology, thinking about the term even just the implicit assumption, I suppose, is that there are ways of knowing, different ways of going about knowing. So religion and science are epistemologically fundamentally different from one another. They have different ways of knowing, and hence different ways of seeing the world, and hence the compromise can't meet via compromise because of these fundamental differences. This is at least my perspective. The other aspect that makes the two like this, they don't meet, is that there's in this sort of shift, there's a shift in focus, and I hope to try and illustrate that in this video. A shift in focus from an inner way of knowing the world, an inner way of knowing, to an apparently outer way of knowing, empirical, outer, in science. And so I want to address this by looking at some key words and how they've changed over time. Okay, so the first word, so religion and science. Let's take those words itself, and what is actually the origin of these words? They come from Latin words. Religion comes from a Latin word, religio, and science comes from a Latin word, scientia. Okay, so that's the derivation of those words. And so these words have a history. Religio and scientia go all the way back, a couple of thousand years, essentially, in their usage in Latin. And there are, I'm not going to talk about, there are kind of more ancient derivations of those words that are very telling, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to talk about religio and scientia. So religio and scientia were words that were used throughout the Middle Ages. And our words religion and science have come from those words. How were they used? Well, we have usage that comes from people like St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. We have the usages of these words from them. And what they primarily meant, at least in origin, they referred to internal qualities of a person. So, for example, if you were said to have religio, a person who has religio was a person who had a kind of pious, sort of a reverential attitude to things. They had cultivated in themselves this inner sort of reverential attitude towards things and towards God. So that person had cultivated the inner quality of religio. Now, if we go over to scientia was actually similar in a way. It was, again, an internal quality of someone. In this case, it was perhaps you might consider it to be more logical or mental characteristic, but it also had moral implications. So this was, I would almost describe it as someone who has cultivated discriminating mind, what I call discriminating mind. In other words, the ability to use their minds to analyze and discriminate between things. Now, Thomas Aquinas and others thought this was an important thing to cultivate because you needed both religio and scientia. Both of these would lead you towards wisdom, what they call sapientia, wisdom, and and they would actually be important in your route to getting closer to God, basically. So it would be a positive thing to have scientia, and also a positive thing to have religio, and one could be strong in one and weaker in the other, or have both in a balanced way. But again, what I want to emphasize here is that they had to do with the person, with the individual. These were inner qualities that a person actually could cultivate, and actually should cultivate. This was the idea. They should cultivate these qualities in order to cultivate wisdom and hence closeness to God, or more direct contact, or sense of connection to the divine. So now, and what I said earlier was that science and religion now have a fundamentally different focus. Well, what happened to these words, scientia and religio? What happened to them? What happened to them was they became externalized. So rather than being religio, rather than being this quality that I would have of sort of reverence in a quality, it became really something. The word religion became something that referred to something external, a body of propositions, a doctrine, a creed. It came to refer to this thing that was sort of an externalized, codified version of this inner quality, codified into doctrines and ultimately dogmas, of course. So the word religion transferred itself from this very much inner focus to one that became entirely about something that's sort of reified out there, a body of a body of injunctions and propositions that we would say constitutes a religion. The injunctions and propositions of Islam being somewhat different than the injunctions and propositions of Christianity, for example, or Judaism. So it became externalized, and let's then talk about scientia. Scientia was again this internal quality, not exactly a skill. I don't think a skill is the right word, but a quality that a person would have that they could cultivate, belonging to them. How did the scientia change into the word science? Scientia changed into the word science by becoming externalized. It became about an external body of knowledge. So the inner quality of scientia could be used to produce facts, and that contributed to a body of knowledge. So a scientist became someone who would work to contribute to a body of knowledge. So you see both these terms, religion and science, while they used to be internal, referring to an individual, they became externalized into these sort of concrete things that are outside of us. So hence this sort of shift in focus of our way of looking at the world from one that was sort of primarily connected to the internal to one that is very much externalized and sort of factualized, if you like. So I'm just using those to sort of illustrate what I feel like is this shift. Now, religion at heart still contains a closer connection to its roots than science does. So religion at heart is still ultimately, although we understand it in common usage, we understand it as referring to a set of propositions and injunctions that belongs to a religion. In fact, that's the sort of pejorative way that we look at religion, that it's simply a set of dogmas. But for many who are in the world's religions, it's about an inner knowing. It's about an inner way of knowing. And so religion would still, I think, at heart retains its connection more than science does to its previous meaning. And hence, so religion is really more about the kind of an inner truth, and science is about an external truth, and hence a very different focus. Science, of course, now claims that all of this inner truth that belongs to religion is simply the product of electrochemistry in our brains and neurons firing, and hence it's not relevant. So really all that's left is this externalized science, the mechanistic world. Okay, so why it isn't a simple matter of compromise between the two. Okay, I'm going to go further. I'm going to take this further. So I want to consider the word. So I want to think about what it means to learn and to know. And we could consider our word education, and Psalmista will know about this because I shared all this in the meditation course. But the word education comes from actually two possible roots, two roots in Latin. One is educare, which has a C-A-R-E on the end, and the other is educare, which is C-E-R-E on the end. These two words have quite different meanings. So the word education then derives from Latin words. The basic meaning of education today is closer to the Latin word educare, C-A-R-E. Educare essentially means to train someone or something. You train them. So you're training someone or something. You're feeding them skills and knowledge from the outside, and you train them to be something or to do something. So that's the meaning of educare, and I think that's how we basically look at education today, at least mainstream education, and not at AU. So educare, though, has a very different meaning, and it essentially literally means to lead out from within. So in this case, if we were sort of leaning towards a kind of education that was based on the word educare, it's to lead out from within. In other words, it's to activate something within someone that brings forth something from them, from their inner world and inner life, from themselves. So there's a well-known phrase that education is the lighting of a fire and not the filling of a pail, not the filling of a bucket. And so what educare is more this lighting of this inner flame, this inner fire, which is the sort of learning curiosity from within, the ability to intuit and learn about the world and express from the inside, and not to have something imposed from the outside. So that's just another example of how there's been this sort of giant and sort of really seismic shift from a world that was really focused on our inner lives as being primary to one that is focused on the external world as being primary. And this is, I feel, very significant, and it's one of the reasons why science and religion could not and perhaps even should not come together, okay? Because these are these fundamentally different orientations, which religions still, to some extent, retains its connection, although not to the degree that it used to, by any means. Okay, so I'm going to take this further, but perhaps, I think in a future video, and I'm going to take this further by I wonder, okay, just one sort of little caveat. In terms of a way of knowing the world based on the outer, based on the empirical, it's empirical means it's basically through the senses, right? So in science we do experiments which we observe through the senses, and when we match up these experimental results observed through the senses with theories that we have, then you've essentially got what sort of science is, right? And what I want to say is that though it's externally focused, what science really doesn't know, I think, is that what happens out here depends on what happens in here. So what I want to say is an apparently external emphasis, but it's not clear to me that we can actually really have an external emphasis, because we are essentially subjective beings. We live in our consciousness irrevocably. So so it's not clear to me we can actually do that, but what we do in science is argue or pretend that we can actually be objective about the outer world. I don't think that is actually possible. So what we kind of do is create the world, not totally, but we're participants in creating the world as we go through our deepest belief systems and structures. It doesn't mean we can choose what reality is. I don't know that we can, but nevertheless, we really do have some kind of deep influence on the world we see. Of course, this is something that is a subject that's being raised by quantum physics, which we will be talking about, I think, next week. But that's a complicated subject. Actually, the answers to it aren't straightforward. But yet there are sort of suggestive aspects to quantum physics about our relationship to reality, to the apparent external reality. But what I want to do in a future video is also talk about this thing called the Book of Nature. So now, this relates to the importance of metaphor, allegory, myth, the importance of these things in the way nature used to be viewed and understood. And of course, metaphor, myth, and allegory are not currently the way we try to understand nature or the way we look at nature. But in the past, prior to the scientific revolution, they were. And so there are great implications to this. And since maybe 150 AD, so almost 2,000 years ago, there was this concept of the thing called the Book of Nature. It wasn't a literal book. It was a metaphorical book. In other words, nature was a book that could be read by somebody. You could read it. And it was full of meaning. And this concept persisted all the way through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And it's really only disappeared in the last couple of hundred years as an important concept. I'm trying to resurrect it because I think it's really, really important in this subject that we are all studying. So I'll make a future video about that and try to go into this idea of the Book of Nature in more depth. But these three things, so the religio and scientia, the origin of the world's word religion and science, and the origin of the word education, and then this idea of the Book of Nature, these are all like sort of pointers, clues to this sort of huge shift in our orientation as human beings. And I think that in there somewhere is kind of a deeper take on this sort of it's not really a chasm between science and religion. It's really that they are simply completely different things. And this sort of tells us why. And the thing is that from one side of the equations, at least from mainstream science's point of view, most of these ways of knowing a religion, these inner ways, have been supposedly discredited, or tossed out. So, but I don't think that's possible, and the whole human being needs to include religio and scientia as internal qualities. Anyway, we'll talk more about this. So this week is we're starting to learn about what science is, and not trying to give you an academic version of what science is. I'm again trying to give you what my perspective of what science is, which especially aspects of science that we might not have known about. So, and one important aspect is how science progresses, and that's what the cartoon video was all about. Is how does science really work? Because if we want to know what science is, we can look at how it works. How does it work? How does it progress? And our ideas about how science works are often not accurate. And so some of these things may be surprising in terms of how science actually works, which is much more mysterious. Anyway, hope you're having a good week. Next week, there's an essay next week, and there's also going to be a Zoom meeting next week on Wednesday, and I'll keep it at the same time unless you will tell me otherwise. I'll keep it at the same time of 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, everyone. Talk to you soon. Okay, bye.